Our world today feels so connected, right? With goods and ideas zipping across the planet in a blink. But that interconnected world wasn't born overnight. Its foundations were laid centuries ago in a really brutal and revolutionary age of commerce and empire. So let's dive into this pivotal period from 1450 to 1750, when for the very first time a truly global economy was forged.
But before we get into the economics and the empires, we have to start right here. Just take a second to read these words. They were written by a visitor to a former slave trading fort in Ghana. This quote reminds us that the huge, world-changing story we're about to tell is, at its core, a deeply human one, with a legacy that we still feel today.
Okay, so this is our time frame. We're looking at 300 years of absolutely explosive change. You see the rise of European sea-based empires, this frantic global search for silver and furs, and of course, the horrifying peak of the transatlantic slave trade. This was a period that literally redrew the map of the world.
And here's the main idea, the big takeaway for this whole period. This new global network didn't just happen. It was built, actively built by two forces that were completely intertwined. The hunt for profit, that's commerce, and the hunt for power, which is empire. You really can't understand one without the other. They went hand in hand. So, what lit the fuse for all this? Well, it really all kicked off with Europe's desperate, insatiable hunger for the incredible riches of Asia.
And this, right here, was the million-dollar question, or maybe billion-dollar question for every European king and merchant back in the 15th century. See, Asia was the world's economic center of gravity. And Europe? Europe was kind of on the sidelines, just desperate to get a piece of the action. The question was, how?
They were facing three huge problems. First, they were completely hooked on Asian goods, spices, silks, fancy cottons. Second, the existing land routes were totally controlled by their rivals, mainly Muslim empires and the powerful Italian city-state of Venice. And third, and this is the absolute key, Europe didn't really make anything that Asia wanted to buy. Their goods were seen as crude, so they had this massive trade deficit with money just pouring out of Europe. So when the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama finally made it around Africa to India, he got a rude awakening. His trade goods were practically laughed at. So, since they couldn't compete fairly on the market, the Portuguese chose another route. They used their superior ships and cannons to literally blast their way in, creating what historians call a trading post empire.
And this sentence sums it all up perfectly. This wasn't about free trade or having the best products. It was about using military might to seize control of key ports and force people to trade on their terms. It was commerce with a cannon.
Okay, so what was actually being traded? What was the fuel for this new global machine? It really boiled down to three key commodities that became the supercharged engines of the world economy: spices, silver, and furs.
The spice trade had been around forever, but Europeans wanted to cut out the middlemen and take it over. First, the Portuguese muscled in, but then came the Dutch East India Company, and they were even more ruthless. I mean, on the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg, they pretty much killed or enslaved the entire native population just to control the market.
But as huge as the spice trade was, it was silver that truly wired the whole planet together for the very first time. The discovery of unbelievable amounts of silver in Spanish America, places like Bolivia and Mexico, unleashed a flood of wealth that circled the entire globe.
Now get this statistic. A staggering 85% of all the silver in the world was coming from the Spanish Americas. So the big question is, where did it all go? You might think it stayed in Spain, but the answer is pretty surprising.
That's right. Most of it ended up in China. Why? Because in the 1570s, China's government made a new rule. All taxes had to be paid in silver. Suddenly, this created a gigantic, continent-sized demand for it. So all the world's silver, whether it came from the Americas or Japan, got sucked into China's economy like a giant vacuum cleaner. They called it the silver drain.
And a huge chunk of that silver came from right here, Potosí, in what's now Bolivia. It was a city that exploded out of nowhere to become as big as London, all of it built on a mountain literally made of silver. But this unimaginable wealth was dug out of the earth at an unimaginable human cost, mostly through the forced labor of Native Americans.
Just listen to what a Spanish priest who worked there wrote. It's an absolutely chilling look at the brutal reality behind the shiny silver that was fueling global trade. Between the toxic mercury used in the process and the constant danger of the mines themselves,
Thousands upon thousands died. Now, what's fascinating is how the silver boom played out so differently for the big players. For Spain, the flood of silver was actually a curse in disguise. It caused runaway inflation, destroyed local businesses, and in the long run, Spain lost its spot as a top global power. But in Japan, another big silver producer, the rulers used the money wisely. They unified the country, invested in their economy, and basically laid the groundwork to become a major industrial power later on.
The third major engine of global commerce was fur, what they called soft gold. A huge demand in Europe and China for warm furs, especially beaver pelts, kicked off this massive hunt across North America and Siberia. This had enormous consequences, not just for the animals, but for the Native American societies who got pulled into the trade, changing their way of life forever.
But the trade in silver and fur, as world-changing as it was, just pales in comparison to the most brutal commerce of all, the trade in human beings.
Just look at that number, 12.5 million. That's the best estimate we have for the number of men, women, and children who were captured in Africa and forced onto ships to be sold into slavery in the Americas. It's a number that's almost impossible to comprehend.
And this map shows you the horrifying scale of that forced migration. It was the largest movement of people in history up to that point. It created what we call the African diaspora, the spread of African peoples and cultures all around the world, and it forever changed the societies on every side of the Atlantic.
The journey itself, the infamous Middle Passage, was a nightmare beyond words. People were packed into the hulls of ships in the most horrific, inhuman conditions you can imagine. We estimate that 1.8 million people died just during the trip across the Atlantic. That's nearly 15%.
And this chart reveals a really crucial fact that's often misunderstood, especially in the United States. Where did the survivors end up? Well, less than 4% of enslaved Africans were brought to what is now the U.S. The vast, overwhelming majority, we're talking over 90%, were shipped to the absolutely brutal sugar plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean.
So, by the time we get to 1750, the world is connected in ways nobody could have imagined before. A new global economy had been violently forged, and it was a story of incredible gains for some and truly devastating losses for others.
And so that leaves us with this final, powerful question to think about. What was gained and what was lost? Yes, the world became more connected, new empires were built, fortunes were made, and goods circled the globe. But who paid the ultimate price for that progress? This incredibly complex legacy of wealth and exploitation, of connection and coercion, that's the world we have all inherited.